This past week, you may have seen reports like this one.
A groundbreaking landmark study has finally revealed there is no such thing as a trans child. Radical leftist mad people running around screaming, protect the trans kids. We've got to protect the kids that claim to be trans. No, we do not, because there are no such thing as a trans child. And that is not just my opinion here. That is scientific and logical fact.
When you say there is no such thing as a trans kid, you may as well say there's no such thing as the sun. Everyone can see you aren't just wrong, you're lying. The existence of one trans kid utterly demolishes your narrative, and there are thousands of them around today. Also, there are over 1.7 million trans adults in the United States. It might be hard for the author of a book titled R.E. Following in the Footsteps of a Flying Predator to wrap his mind around, but most people understand that trans adults were once trans kids. Unlike Athena, we don't erupt full-grown from the mind of a god, regardless of how fantastic we may look. We do exist, and people can see us, so saying we do not makes you look quite silly, as is probably obvious. Not only are the claims false, but they're presented in a dishonest way. They have to be. Lying is the only way people like this can pretend they have a leg to stand on. Like flat earthers, they won't engage with the thousands of peer-reviewed scientific papers that prove beyond all doubt they are categorically wrong, but they will crow from the rooftops about the one study every few years that they can misrepresent in such a way to make it appear to support their position. And when you call them out on their dishonesty, they cry, "Conspiracy! It's a conspiracy to silence the truth!" Hence why the gender-critical movement, the name changed from trans-exclusionary radical feminist in recognition of the fact they're not feminist.
Do you describe yourself as a feminist?
No.
Have you described yourself as a feminist in the past?
I was a feminist, and then it became a real barrier to what I wanted to achieve.
And to be inclusive of the neo-fascists that make up a large part of their group is a conspiracy theory, distinct from flat earth and moon landing denial only in the unique aspect that they're harming real people with their bullshit. But knowing they're lying about obvious things anyone can check is one thing. Knowing what's true is another. So, what are the facts? This is a bit of an ogre with several layers to it, so buckle up. If Layer 1 was the kind of misinformation Storybox and Daily Wire spread about this, then Layer 2 is the Daily Mail, which is their source. In an article published last week, the tabloid claimed a new study concluded being trans is just a phase, leading sloppy, brain-missing con men like the Daily Wire and Storybox to declare, quote, "There is no such thing as trans kids." The bullet points directly under the headline contradict that, stating that 11% of kids reported being unhappy with their gender, which is not the same as identifying as a different gender, and that only 19% of those no longer felt that way as adults. Even if this were talking about trans people, a 19% desistance rate is a far cry from most kids grow out of it. 81%, a supermajority, more than 3/4, did not grow out of it. What are they talking about? The article goes on to explain that the study in question tracked 2,700 kids in the Netherlands, asking them every 3 years about their satisfaction with their gender. 11% indicated, quote, some level of discontent with their gender. This harkens back to the Zucker gender diversity study, where the 80% desistance rate transphobes like to throw around came from.
80% of young people that have this so-called gender dysphoria, whether it's social media driven or not, grow out of it by the time they're 18.
Which was deeply flawed for its failure to disambiguate trans kids from gender non-conforming ones. In the same way, here, the data only shows dissatisfaction with the kid's perception of their assigned gender, not identification with a different one. By age 25, just 4% indicated they were, quote, often or, quote, sometimes discontent with their gender, the article says. Notice the terms have changed from some level to only the categories of often and sometimes specifically. That's a trick fraudsters use when they want to tamper with the data. Also, 4% of 11% is 36%, which doesn't match any of the numbers previously stated. To clarify, that means if we take the article at face value, 36% of those assumed to be trans as kids remained trans as adults. That's literally saying there are trans kids, and Storybox is blatantly lying. This article then presents a chart, supposedly based on the paper. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it, and then goes on to quote a random conservative partisan who, predictably, leaps to the totally unsupported conclusion that this shows policies prohibiting proven life-saving medical care somehow make sense. Then the article spends a couple of sentences admitting that the study followed a different number of kids than they originally said, followed participants from the general population rather than patients at a gender clinic, kids diagnosed with GD, or any other group that might indicate an attempt to gain data about trans kids and desistants, and that the way they represented the key question, yes, one single question is the entire basis for all of this, was also exactly the opposite of the truth. Now they say the question was, quote, I wish to be the opposite sex, true, false, or sometimes. Sex is not the same as gender, of course, and the entailments that can be drawn from this leading question are quite different from what the article has been asserting this whole time. The article throws up a bunch of smokescreens, such as a random mention of the fake controversy over Easter falling on Trans Day of Visibility this year, a quote from Dr. Jay Richards, director of the DeVos, yes, those DeVos's, Center for Life, Religion, and Family, which is funded by the Heritage Foundation, lying about the aforementioned and overwhelmingly debunked Zucker desistance study and comparing saving children's lives through evidence-based medicine to eugenics. Because of course he does. Finally, the article mentions the research was published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior, and that brings us to Layer 3, the journal. First thing, the Archives of Sexual Behavior is a journal headed by Ken Zucker. Yes, the same Zucker who published the study behind that old 80% desistance rate claim. The same Zucker whose clinical practice in Toronto was shut down because the province banned conversion therapy. Second, the Archives of Sexual Behavior came under fire from the scientific community last May for poor research ethics, lack of intellectual integrity, failure to disclose financial ties to anti-LGBT political groups, which biases the research, and, frankly, for Zucker. In an open letter to the journal's board and distributor, over 300 scientists and major organizations declared they would no longer fund, submit papers to, peer review for, or otherwise engage with the ASB until and unless, quote, Zucker is replaced with an editor who has a demonstrated record of integrity on LGBTQ+ matters, and especially trans matters. This letter was issued in response to Michael Bailey's retracted paper attempting to redo disgraced former researcher Lisa Littman's fatally flawed and also retracted study on the latter's coined term, rapid onset gender dysphoria. You see, this journal published Bailey's paper despite the fact that it repeated the same methodological flaws that Littman's original paper engaged in, such as deliberately biasing the surveyed sample, among many other crimes against science. Bailey himself is also on the editorial board of ASB, which indicates some measure of preferential treatment may have been involved. So, long story short, the scientific community has rejected ASB as a valid source of scientific research, and if they don't clean up their act soon, every member of the editorial board will similarly be banished from the halls of academic acceptance for their continued association with this trash fire. So bearing in mind that this journal has deliberately disassociated itself from any semblance of credibility, Layer 4, the study, titled Development of gender non-contentedness during adolescence and early adulthood, I say the whole thing to make it easier for anyone so inclined to look it up, begins badly. It reveals that their data was taken from the TRAILS published material. TRAILS, the Tracking Adolescents Individual Lives Survey, is an ongoing study of 2,773 participants, comparing a population cohort and a clinical cohort intended to reveal insights into how depression, anxiety, rule-breaking behavior, and other factors might lead to a distinct developmental pathway. It is not a study of gender diversity, gender nonconformity, or anything to do with transgender people. To make this crystal clear, statistically, the TRAILS sample cohorts should contain approximately 27 to 135 transgender adults. The data on how many there are, when they transitioned, or anything at all about their current gender identity is not reported. It is not something the study measured. So drawing conclusions from a dataset based on data that isn't recorded in that dataset is, to be blunt, making shit up. So what did the authors investigate? TRAILS participants were given a survey every 2 to 3 years as they grew up, alongside evaluations of their health, personality, substance use, biological response to stress, even their genetics. Never mind all that data, these authors are only interested in the survey that asked 110 questions pertaining to their self-report behaviors and various items about their mental health. A single question out of that 110 even came close to the subject of gender, the one mentioned previously. I wish to be of the opposite sex. True, false, or sometimes. If anything other than false was selected, these authors took that to mean a declaration of discontent with one's assigned gender. That's practically the same thing as coming out as trans, right? That's just so bad. Let's set aside the glaring problem of conflating sex and gender in a paper ostensibly about gender. This is twisting a single question response to put words in people's mouths. Like the proverbial lawyer asking a witness when he stopped beating his wife, the assumptions are baked in such a way that the results are incapable of being accurate. It is, as Feynman put it, not even wrong. It's throwing a basketball at a hockey game. You aren't winning or losing, you're playing the wrong sport. The paper goes on to summarize some of the relevant research, naturally selecting only examples that seem to support the preconceived conclusion they want to present. We see a hint of the probable original intent at the end of this section, when they say, quote, "This project aimed to study the development of gender non-contentedness and which factors are associated with that." They do present information indicating that gender non-contentedness typically coincides with increased rates of low self-esteem and depression, and to their credit, they refrain from attempting to show causation by correlation. But on the other hand, that's rather like stating numerous studies show that daytime is warmer than night. The sun may be involved. However, that doesn't last. When it comes to the analysis, 3 classes are proposed: no dissatisfaction, increasing dissatisfaction, or decreasing dissatisfaction. Participants were fitted into these classes, and any that did not fit cleanly into one class were deleted. This was done, quote, to exclude individuals with a trajectory that was largely deviating from the mean of the class. Then, to address the problem of missing data, new data was created by a randomization process with parameters ensuring the fabricated information fit the model. Behold, the data confirm that there are 3 and only 3 possible trajectories. In fairness to the authors, they do state plainly and frequently that the individuals who did not fit these trend lines were deleted. But how many and what their inclusion might have shown is not addressed. To be clear, for all we can tell, participants could have consistently demonstrated dissatisfaction and been deleted, or could have started high, decreased, then rose again with the onset of puberty, and been deleted. Or they could have had rising gender discontent until age 18, then a sudden drop-off, possibly following gender confirmation surgery, since the transition of participants is not recorded in the data this paper utilized. Since that rise and fall wouldn't fit the 3 trajectories proposed, all such participants would be deleted and replaced by random data that did. So when the data edited and shaped to fit the proposed model just so happens to demonstrate that model, of course it does. It's begging the question with data, only less honest. There's quite a lot more. It would take a dedicated video essay to address everything. Again, to the author's credit, they mention in the limitations section that, quote, no data on gender identity were available, though that's buried in the middle of a paragraph near the end of the paper, and never mind the fact that lacking that data is an admission this paper is based on nothing of actual substance. You can't assess gender satisfaction from a single question about a different category pulled from a much longer survey that isn't remotely related. This paper, if presented with good intentions, should have made that expressly clear from the outset, and then sought to identify relationships between depression, anxiety, and whether disidentification with assigned sex had any bearing, rather than try to establish and describe an assumed trend model that just so happens to affirm the biases of the editorial board and their politically motivated backers based on fabricated answers to a question participants were not asked. Oh, and remember that graph from the Daily Mail I asked you to put a pin in for later? Here's the one from the ASB paper they copied from. They even managed to get that wrong. This degree of incompetence on every level verges on an art form. So to sum up, transphobes are spreading misinformation about a tabloid article reporting on a biased journal's bogus study, which itself is based on a carefully cherry-picked shred of tangentially connected and partially fabricated information from a different study not at all related to the topic, and still somehow fails to support its conclusions. But having your work double-checked must be hard without peer review. It's deliberate dishonesty all the way down, folks. But that's kind of a lot to keep in your mental database, should you need to rebut a bigot making claims about this study. So save this video in your bookmarks and just drop the link on them whenever it comes up. We've already done the work for you, and it is, I assure you, our pleasure. For the Transpositions, I've been Ember Belrad.